The courtroom was silent when the judge read the sentence. Not the stunned kind of silence you hear on TV, but the heavy, suffocating kind that presses down on your chest. Todd Chrisley stood there in a tailored suit that no longer meant anything, his face fixed, his jaw tight, the last remnants of control slipping through his fingers. 12 years. Federal prison. No edits. No retakes. No confessional chair to spin the narrative. Just consequences. Outside, cameras waited. They always did. 4 years, Todd Chrisley had lived inside the glow of celebrity, sharp suits, manicured perfection, a life polished for television. He was the man who made control look effortless. Money answered problems. Lawyers fixed mistakes. Image covered everything else. But on this day in November 2022, the illusion cracked. The federal conviction for bank fraud and tax evasion wasn't just a legal defeat. It was a public unmasking. The fall had been quiet at first. Subtle. Almost invisible to fans. While Chrisley Knows best painted a picture of wealth, discipline, and family dominance, federal investigators were working in the shadows. Bank records didn't lie. Loan applications told a different story than the one broadcast on cable television. Millions of dollars borrowed under false pretenses. Income hidden. Taxes unpaid. The financial house of cards stacked high enough that when it fell, it wouldn't just collapse, it would explode. By the time Todd realized the walls were closing in, it was already too late. Federal prosecutors don't rush. They collect. They wait. They let patterns form. And when they finally move, they move with precision. The case laid out against Todd and his wife, Julie, wasn't built on one bad decision. It was built on years of calculated risk, of believing that wealth and influence could keep consequences permanently out of reach. The sentence wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Prison. Not the cinematic kind. Not the violent fantasy people imagine. But the psychological grind of federal incarceration, where time stretches, identity erodes, and survival depends on discipline rather than dominance. January 2023 arrived colder than Todd expected. Dawn broke over Florida as a transport vehicle rolled toward Federal Prison Camp Pensacola. The facility didn't look like the cages people picture when they hear the word prison. No towering walls. No razor wire glittering in the sun. That was the trap. The absence of visible brutality masked something worse. The stripping away of individuality. Todd stepped out carrying what the Bureau of Prisons allowed. Not what he wanted. Not what he was used to. No personal stylist. No phone buzzing with staff updates. No authority. His name, once a brand, was reduced to an inmate number. Fame didn't matter here. In fact, it made things harder. Inside, eyes watched. Prison camps may house non-violent offenders, but hierarchy still exists. Respect still matters. Weakness is noticed instantly. Todd understood that quickly. The confidence that once commanded rooms now had to be recalibrated. Too much arrogance invited resentment. Too much vulnerability invited exploitation. This wasn't reality television. There were no confessionals to frame the narrative. Only observation, routine, and unspoken rules. Days fell into rigid patterns. Wake-up counts. Work assignments. Chow hall lines that erased status with every step forward. Todd, who once controlled entire households and production schedules, now waited like everyone else. That was the shock that cut deepest. Prison didn't punish him with violence. It punished him with sameness. Meanwhile, outside the gates, the investigation's echoes continued. Court documents circulated. Analysts dissected the case. The evidence was methodical and unforgiving. Loan applications inflated income. Bank statements contradicted sworn declarations. IRS records traced money that had been deliberately concealed. Prosecutors didn't need emotion. The numbers spoke clearly enough. What made the case so unsettling wasn't just the fraud. It was the dual life. On screen, Todd was the disciplinarian patriarch preaching accountability. Off-screen, federal agents alleged a system built to dodge it. The contrast fueled public fascination and outrage. Was it performance? Self-delusion? Or a belief that rules were for other people? Inside prison, Those questions followed Todd like shadows. Other inmates recognized him. Some mocked quietly. Others tested boundaries. Celebrity in prison is a liability. It paints a target without offering protection. Todd learned quickly to keep his head down, his words measured, his routine precise. Survival wasn't about intimidation. It was about consistency. The hardest hours came at night. When lights dimmed and the noise settled, the reality of time crept in. 12 years isn't a headline. It's birthdays missed. Holidays erased. Relationships stretched thin by distance and stigma. Prison doesn't just confine bodies. It compresses futures. Todd, once obsessed with control, now had to learn patience. Letters came. So did legal updates, appeals, motions. The language of hope wrapped in legal caution. But prison doesn't pause for possibility. Days kept moving whether freedom felt close or impossibly far. Todd took refuge in structure, work details, reading, fitness. Discipline replaced dominance. Routine replaced luxury. Then came the realization that marked a turning point. Prison wasn't trying to break him. It didn't need to. It simply waited for him to confront himself without distractions. No cameras to perform for. No wealth to shield mistakes. Just long hours to replay decisions that once felt untouchable. But survival demanded adaptation. Todd learned when to speak and when silence was safer. He learned that respect came from predictability, not bravado. That dignity wasn't about image, but restraint. Slowly, the man who once thrived on attention began to disappear into routine, not defeated, but altered. Outside, public opinion fractured. Some saw punishment. Others saw hypocrisy exposed. The case became a cautionary tale whispered across boardrooms and living rooms alike. Wealth could amplify mistakes, but it couldn't erase evidence. Cameras could craft narratives, but they couldn't outshine federal indictments. Then, buried deep in trial transcripts and financial disclosures, one detail resurfaced, an internal document prosecutors described as pivotal. A paper trail that didn't just show misrepresentation, but intent. It suggested that the strategy wasn't reactive. It was planned, systematic, deliberate. For Todd, learning that detail inside a prison camp miles away from any red carpet was devastating. Not because it surprised him, but because it confirmed what the prosecution had believed all along. This wasn't a momentary lapse. It was a pattern. And patterns are hard to outrun when they finally catch you. As the lights dimmed one night at FPC Pensacola, Todd lay awake staring into darkness, understanding something most people never do until it's too late. Prison wasn't the punishment. Exposure was. The exposure of choices made when no one was supposed to be watching. And as the truth settled in, one question loomed heavier than the sentence itself. If survival now depended on discipline and mental resilience, could the man who built his empire on control learn to live without it? If you thought the sentence was the punishment, you were wrong. Because prison doesn't test your body first, it tests your mind. By the time Todd Chrisley settled into the rhythm of Federal Prison Camp Pensacola, the shock had worn off. What replaced it was something far more dangerous: awareness. Prison was no longer a headline or a scandal. It was a system. A closed ecosystem where every look meant something, every word carried weight, and every mistake echoed longer than it should. Todd understood quickly that survival wasn't about fear, it was about perception. The camp woke early. Fluorescent lights snapped on before sunrise, erasing dreams without apology. Men lined up, counted, moved. No exceptions. No negotiations. Todd, once surrounded by assistants and producers, now waited shoulder to shoulder with men who had lost everything long before he arrived. Some were quiet. Some were bitter. Some were watching him closely. Fame doesn't disappear in prison. It mutates. At first, whispers followed him. The TV guy. The rich one. The loud one from cable. Some inmates were curious, others dismissive. A few saw opportunity. Todd learned quickly that attention, even neutral attention, was a liability. The wrong conversation could turn into a rumor. The wrong rumor could turn into a problem. Prison didn't reward personality. It punished it. So Todd did something unexpected. He shrank. Not physically, but socially. He stopped trying to explain himself. He avoided talking about his case. He didn't correct assumptions. In a place where ego often sparked conflict, restraint became his shield. That choice didn't come naturally. Outside, Todd had built his life on being heard. Inside, silence was safer. But prison doesn't allow anyone to disappear completely. Work assignments came next. Cleaning, maintenance, repetition. Jobs that blurred days together until time lost meaning. Todd scrubbed floors that would be dirty again by noon. He wiped tables where conversations he wasn't part of echoed loudly. The work wasn't hard. The humility was. Meanwhile, outside the wire, the case continued to breathe. Appeals moved slowly through the system. Legal analysts debated the sentence. Critics dissected the fraud scheme in interviews and podcasts. The contrast between the polished television persona and the cold financial evidence only sharpened public fascination. The story had evolved from reality TV downfall into something darker, a warning about believing your own image. Inside, Todd received updates in fragments. Letters. Headlines clipped by family. Each reminder of the outside world felt surreal, like reading about someone else's life. The man in the articles wasn't the one folding prison laundry or counting steps between buildings. Yet they shared a name. And that name carried weight he could no longer control. The psychological pressure built slowly, the way water erodes stone. There were no dramatic confrontations. No cinematic fights. Just accumulation. Long days. Short nights. Conversations that ended too soon. Moments of isolation surrounded by people. Prison didn't break people with force. It wore them down with monotony and reflection. Todd began to notice the toll on others. Men who arrived confident slowly flattened. Men who clung to anger burned out. The ones who survived best shared a trait Todd had never prioritized before: adaptability without entitlement. They accepted the rules without internalizing them as identity. They followed structure without fighting it. So Todd adapted. He built routines with purpose. Exercise at the same time every day. Reading schedules. Writing letters. Mental discipline replaced image management. He stopped thinking in years and started thinking in weeks. Then days. Then hours. That shift wasn't just practical, it was survival. But prison tests resolve when you least expect it. One afternoon, tension rippled through the camp. A rumor spread fast, too fast to be ignored. A financial dispute between inmates. Nothing violent yet, but volatile. In prison, instability doesn't announce itself. It circulates quietly, changing the atmosphere. Todd felt it immediately. Conversations shortened. Eyes tracked movement more carefully. He stayed clear. Kept to routine. But danger in prison doesn't always require participation. Proximity is enough. That night, lockdown came early. Counts stretched longer than usual. The message was clear: something had gone wrong. Todd lay awake listening to the unfamiliar quiet, aware that safety in prison is conditional. You can do everything right and still be pulled into someone else's chaos. The next morning, things returned to normal on the surface. But prison never forgets tension. It stores it. That was when Todd realized a second truth: survival wasn't just about avoiding conflict. It was about understanding human nature stripped of comfort. Prison removed distractions. What remained was impulse, regret, ambition, resentment. People didn't change here. They revealed themselves. And some revelations were unsettling. Todd saw men who had once been powerful reduced to compliance. Others who had been overlooked outside now commanded respect inside. Status had nothing to do with money anymore. It was about reliability. About whether your word meant something when nothing else did. That lesson landed hard. Meanwhile, news arrived that shifted everything. A legal update. Not a victory. Not a loss. But a detail buried deep in filings. A financial document prosecutors had relied on heavily, now being debated in appellate discussions. Not enough to overturn the conviction, but enough to reopen scrutiny. Hope is dangerous in prison. It lifts you just high enough to feel the fall. Todd felt it anyway. He couldn't stop himself. The idea that the story wasn't finished sparked something restless. But prison punishes anticipation. Time slows when you wait for change. Days stretched again. Routines felt heavier. The mind replayed scenarios it couldn't influence. That's when the real war began. Not with other inmates. Not with the system. But internally. Who was Todd Chrisley without control? Without wealth? Without cameras? Without the ability to rewrite narratives? Prison forced that question daily. The man who had built a persona on certainty now lived in uncertainty. And the longer that lasted, the more uncomfortable the answers became. He wasn't innocent of arrogance. He wasn't unaware of risk. He had believed he could outmaneuver consequences because he always had before. That belief hadn't been reckless in his world. It had been rewarded. Until it wasn't. Prison stripped away the illusion that intelligence alone could solve everything. And then came the call. Controlled. Legal in tone. An update from outside that changed the emotional temperature instantly. Julie Chrisley's situation. Her sentence. Her placement. The separation hit harder than the bars ever could. Prison isolates physically, but distance from loved ones is the real punishment. Todd ended the call unchanged on the outside. Broken on the inside. That night, discipline cracked. Not visibly. Internally. The kind of fracture no one else sees. Prison doesn't allow grief to unfold naturally. There's no space for it. No privacy. No release. You swallow it and keep moving. But swallowed grief accumulates. By now, Todd understood the truth most inmates learn too late. Prison survival isn't about toughness. It's about endurance without erosion. About staying intact when everything around you encourages fragmentation. And just as he began to regain emotional balance, another development surfaced, quiet, understated, but explosive. Federal investigators were re-examining parts of the financial trail connected to the case. Not for reversal. For precedent. For future prosecutions. Todd's case was becoming a reference point. A template. He wasn't just serving time. He had become an example. That realization hit harder than the sentence ever did. Because examples don't get forgotten. As lights dimmed again and the camp settled into uneasy sleep, Todd stared into the darkness, understanding something chilling. Prison might end one day. But the consequences of being made an example never do. And the most dangerous part wasn't behind him yet. Because Chapter 3 isn't about surviving prison. It's about what happens when survival changes you, and whether freedom, when it finally comes, is anything like the life you lost. By the time Todd Chrisley crossed the midpoint of his sentence, the man who had entered Federal Prison Camp Pensacola no longer existed in the same form. Prison hadn't beaten him down. It had sanded him down. Edges softened. Certainty replaced by calculation. Confidence stripped of performance. Survival had required something Todd had avoided his entire life. Surrendering control without surrendering identity. The days no longer shocked him. That was the most unsettling part. Routine had become instinct. Exercise. Repeat. Time moved differently now, not slower, but flatter. Days no longer felt distinct enough to measure loss. That numbness was protective, but dangerous. It made forgetting easy. Forgetting who you were. Forgetting who you wanted to be after. Todd watched it happen to others. Men who stopped planning for life beyond the fence. Men who spoke only in prison timelines. Men who survived incarceration but never escaped it mentally. Todd understood that fate was worse than the sentence itself. Freedom without direction was just another form of confinement. So he made a decision. Quiet. Personal. No announcements. He would leave prison intact, or not at all. The mental shift wasn't dramatic. It was disciplined. Todd began treating prison like a test of restraint instead of a punishment. Every interaction became intentional. He listened more than he spoke. Observed patterns. Studied people the way prosecutors had once studied him. Prison, stripped of distraction, revealed raw psychology. Fear masked as bravado. Regret disguised as humor. Power redefined by consistency. Todd learned to respect that ecosystem without surrendering to it. Outside, the world continued to debate his name. Documentaries revisited the case. Commentators reframed the narrative. Some argued the sentence was justified. Others claimed it was excessive. The fraud itself became secondary to the symbolism. A public figure exposed. A lifestyle dismantled. Todd Chrisley had become shorthand for hubris meeting consequence. Inside, none of that mattered. Prison didn't care about opinion. Only behavior. Then came the moment Todd had anticipated and feared in equal measure, the approach of release planning. Not freedom yet. Preparation for it. Meetings. Paperwork. Transitional expectations. The system, having taken years of his life, now expected him to re-enter society without friction. Re-entry is where many fail. Todd knew it. He'd seen it in men released before him. The anxiety. The disorientation. The sudden return of choice. Prison removes decision-making. Freedom demands it. That shift breaks people who haven't prepared. Todd prepared obsessively. He planned days, weeks, boundaries. He wrote letters to himself about what not to do, what not to chase. Fame, he realized, wasn't inherently dangerous. Dependence on it was. Control wasn't the problem. Obsession with it was. The irony wasn't lost on him. Prison had taught him restraint the outside world never had. Then came the final months. They were the hardest. Not because of fear, but anticipation. Time slowed again. Every calendar page carried weight. Conversations turned reflective. Men spoke about mistakes they couldn't undo. Families they'd lost. Futures that felt theoretical. Todd listened. Absorbed. Stored the warnings. One night, an inmate asked him a question that lingered longer than anything a prosecutor had ever said. "Do you think they'll let you be normal again?" Todd didn't answer right away. Normal wasn't the goal. Honest was. Release day arrived without ceremony. No cameras. No speeches. Just paperwork, a final count, and a walk through doors that didn't slam behind him. Florida air felt unfamiliar. Too open. Too loud. Todd stood still longer than necessary, grounding himself before movement. Freedom felt fragile. The world hadn't paused while he was gone. Technology had shifted. Conversations had evolved. Opinions were entrenched. Todd stepped back into a society that knew his name but not the man who now carried it. Rebuilding wasn't about money. That was the temptation. It was about restraint. About choosing anonymity over attention when attention was easiest. Todd understood that redemption wasn't something you declared. It was something you practiced consistently until people stopped arguing about it. But the final twist didn't come from the public. It came privately. Months after release, Todd received confirmation of something he had suspected but never proven. Internal reviews within financial institutions had quietly updated compliance procedures, procedures shaped directly by the failures exposed in his case. His downfall hadn't just ended a chapter. It had altered how risk was measured for others. Todd Chrisley hadn't just been punished. He had been institutionalized as a lesson. That realization settled heavily. Not with bitterness, but clarity. He couldn't erase that legacy. But he could contextualize it. He could choose whether his name represented denial or accountability. Prison had taken years. It had taken status. It had taken certainty. What it hadn't taken was agency. Todd now understood the truth most people learn too late. Survival isn't about avoiding consequences. It's about becoming someone who doesn't need to outrun them. Prison hadn't saved him. It had exposed him. And exposure, once survived, can either destroy you or discipline you. Todd Chrisley walked forward carrying both truths. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the past refuses to stay buried.